Okay, in this tutorial we're going to take a look at how to apply your normal maps and displacement maps to your model in Maya and how to render them out. So what I have right now is kind of where we're going to get to. I'm giving you a file here that is the head that I've been working on, set up, ready to be rendered, ready to be basically put to the end, but we're going to work our way back to this spot by bringing in the base model, which will sort of be basically whatever model you're bringing in for your own head, and you're going to match it up to the location and size of my head. So just a couple things. Let's do a quick tour of this scene. So I'm going to go to Panels, Perspective, and go to my Perspective Cam. So this scene right now has just a few elements in it. It has, as you saw, two cameras there, the perspective camera and the render camera. It has a couple different lights. I have a dome light here, which has an HDR image attached to it. I have an area light here, which has an HDR image attached to it, and that's kind of giving some light from the side and a little bit from the back. And I also have a spherical light here, which is just providing some basic light for the scene as well. So it's a relatively simple lighting setup. And when we bring in the head, we're going to basically try to match real-world scale. So I did my best job to measure the size of my head, and I measured that at the dimensions from more or less the top of my skull, where I could figure that out, to basically the bottom of my chin. And if I come in here and grab one of my measure tools, if I go to Create, Measure Tools, Distance tool, and I just click at the top of my head here, and then I'll hold down Shift and click somewhere toward the bottom of my chin. That'll just create a straight line there, even though I clicked over here. And this gives me a measurement in my world units, which is centimeters. And this is saying that that distance there is about 25 centimeters, which is more or less the size of my head across those dimensions. I mean, it could be off by a couple centimeters here and there, and it's not going to be a big difference. And that includes for your head as well. My head is probably pretty close to your head in terms of its size, because most humans have fairly similarly sized heads. If you measure your own head, you can get a really accurate result. And where this comes in handy has to do with lighting, and especially when we deal with subsurface scattering, so that the lighting information is as realistic as possible. When we're working in Arnold, it does work based on real-world scale, and that's really, really true when it comes down to subsurface scattering and applying a very skin-like material. We want it to behave in a predictable fashion. We don't want the head to either be too big or too small. So in this case here, this is quite an easily known quantity, and I suggest that when you bring in your head, that you scale it up to match. Now the head that you're going to bring in, it's important that you choose the right one. So if I go to File, Import, and I go and find the head in question here, inside my folder here, Data, we were working with before, we started out with a version of our head when we were creating the displacement UVs where we had both sides of the UVs, the first tile and the second tile. And then we created a version for just the first tile, and then we created a version for just the second tile. Well, we want that original one that had both tiles together. So you can see that my naming convention here is important to keep track of what each tile does. Now this is at level 1. So I actually need to export out a level 3, which is what this is here. And that way I can make sure that it's matching the resolution that I need. So you need to go back into ZBrush, go to your level 3 sculpt, make sure that you have loaded into your scene this one here that has both tiles on it, and then export out level 3. So that's what this is here. So if I just take a look at it, it is really tiny. Look, tiny head, tiny me. And the reason for this is because I have applied a scale factor overall on my mesh. And when I did that, I sized it up to match the real world scale here. Now when this came in, you'll notice too that the center point is way down here at the origin, and I don't want that. So I'm going to first things first. I'm going to go in and choose Modify, Center Pivot. And that will center the pivot right there on my little head. And then I would scale this up. Now the scale factor I'm going to use is based on my specific head, and I have kept track of that. I've known, because I do this a lot, I scale up these heads a lot in here. For me it's 12.316. And I can kind of position this into place here, more or less, to match my head. Now this is me matching my own head. It's going to be a lot easier than you matching to my head. So if it's not 100% perfect, that's okay. Just try to keep it within the basic bounds of top of the head there and bottom of the chin there. Those two things will probably be pretty close for you. And then what we're going to need to do is get rid of the other head. So I'm just going to go in and I'll hold down Shift, and I'm going to drag a selection just somewhere across both of these. And what that will do is it will sort of, it'll deselect what was selected, and it will select what was not selected in this case. I don't want to grab the eyes. In fact, it's probably pretty important that I make sure that my eyes do match as well as possible. So here's my new mesh. Came in, just take a look at these eyes real quick in the perspective view. Now, one of the things in my case that you'll notice, and this is probably just particular to me, but I will point it out, is that there is a little bit of interpenetration there on the eyeballs. And I think that really what's happening there is that, let's just see, I just want to go back down again. I think really what it is, that this is probably the right position, but ultimately, once I apply the displacement map, this will disappear, right? That it will actually push the eyelid up there so that I don't end up seeing that in the render. There's a couple things here like this. This is really black right now because that's the eyeball that is, it has a particular material applied to it. And then when you bring in your eyeballs, you might not need to bring in your eyeballs necessarily. You could perhaps adjust my ones, or you could export your own eyeballs, bring them in, and apply the materials that I show you here in the hypershade in just a little bit. So that's up to you. Now, as soon as I bring this mesh in, you'll notice that it looks very faceted. It's got this, nickeled appearance to it. And so what I want to do for that is to grab the mesh, and I'll go into the modeling menu set, and I'll go to Mesh Display, and we will click on Soften Edge. And that just changes the way that we view the edges of our faces, essentially. All right, so there's a couple things that I don't need to keep in here. I can get rid of that measurement tool. You don't necessarily need to create that. That was just for me to do a demonstration with. So I'll just go into my outliner, and I'll get rid of those. There's a few other things I might clean up in this scene before I hand it over to you, so it doesn't necessarily look as untidy as it is. And so right now, what we're going to do is I'll just save that for the moment. I'll save this as a new version. I do have version saving on, but it's always a good idea to check that you have incremental saves on. And I'm just going to go ahead and save this one as something like Jason had V-Ray, and we'll do this as demo. There we go. All right. Now, I've brought the head in, and it can be valuable to kind of just see, without applying anything to the head yet, what this actually looks like. So there are different ways that I can preview this. I could do a quick render, but one cool thing that I can do, if I come in here to my render cam, is I can, since I'm working with V-Ray, and that is the renderer that I'm going to work from, first off, I want to make sure that V-Ray is enabled in my plugin manager. So if you don't have V-Ray, then you could follow along and you could do a similar setup for things like Arnold. But obviously you're going to have to work within Arnold's parameters. So here I have somewhere in here, I know it's enabled, so there it is, V-Ray for Maya, and just make sure that that's enabled. And if you have that enabled, and if you're working from a sufficiently robust system and have a good graphics card, then you can go ahead and we can change our renderer to the V-Ray IPR. And what this is it's an interactive photorealistic renderer. was what IPR stands for. And it kind of gives us a real-time um, feedback of rendering, and it tries to render it as quickly as possible. And so this is a renderer that goes through, and instead of just rendering an individual bucket, it goes through and it gradually improves the quality of the renderer over time. So you can get a quick result that's not quite as quality, but you get to see the result quicker. And right now, as you can see here in this scene, we have just a sort of gray result. And that has to do with the type of material that's applied to our mesh and the kind of lighting. So the lighting in here is worth speaking about before we go much further. I'm just going to step out here for a second, and I'll go to a different renderer. I'll change this back to the legacy renderer. There's a reason I'm not using Viewport 2.0, and the reason for that is as soon as I start applying some of my other materials, it could cause a problem. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, depending on the type of V-Ray materials that you use. Right now it seems okay, but if it starts to cause issues, you might just have to go back to the legacy default viewport renderer. So the lights right now, there is a big light in here that's giving us the majority of our color information and our lighting information, and that's the dome light. In fact, I'll just rename this as call it V-Ray _ dome light. There we go. Now, I have turned off the visibility of the texture that's applied there, so I'll just turn that back on real quick and press 6 to be able to see my, there we go. Oops. And so what this is it's a big HDR image of the inside of this studio. And I always like using this image because it's got a lot of nice color and a lot of brightness to it. And I provide this to you with this video here, just down below in the, not the comment section, but in the description area, you can find a link to this HDR image. And if I just go ahead and quickly show that one to you, pop over here and click on View. It's this Panorama Canterbury image here, and this is just popping up in F-check, so it doesn't look beautiful, but it does give you kind of an idea. There's a lot of color information in here. It's just a standard HDR image. So I use that as my main color source for this scene. Also, and now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and turn off the visibility of it again, just because I find it a little bit distracting. You don't need to change anything here about this image. I have set it up for you. And if I turn on show in viewport to just disabled, it doesn't affect how it renders, it just affects whether or not we can see it here. The other light that we have in here is an area light, and this area light has attached to it a HDR image as well. So this HDR image here, if we click on it, is part of the Zybig suite, or ZBYG. I don't know if that's meant to be pronounced any way in particular. I just pronounce it Zybig. And if I click on that, this is number 7 of Zybig Suite. And it's just, if you think about this wrapped around a cylinder, for instance, then it's a bunch of lights that are, one is just a little bit brighter than the other ones. And it gives a nice kind of even coloring with a little bit of shadowing. Now the Zybig Suite is really cool, and I recommend it to everyone. And I just pull this up here so I can point it out to you. zbyg.deviantart.com, and the rest of this address here, I'll leave it in the description. This is just the first HDRI pack by Zybig, but you can find that, I don't know if Zybig's a guy or a girl, but you can find out that I'm going to go out on a limb, has several other suites. And you could just search for what I do usually is Zybig HDR, and you'll find a whole bunch of suites for the images that Zybig's created. And they're just really common, they're really popular, and so I use number 7 quite a bit because I find it very useful. And then finally, I just have this spherical light here, and just set to a particular intensity, and this is just to provide a little bit of extra fill and some additional highlights for the eyes. So the eyes themselves also are worth mentioning because there is the eyeball on the inside, and there's what I have selected right now, which is the cornea. And you'll notice that the cornea is transparent, and that's because I've applied to it a shiny but transparent material. And on the inside there is the eyeball, which has a different material applied to it. So, and then the skin, or just the face in general, has its own material applied. So let's just go and quickly take a look at those. If I go inside my Hypershade here, the first materials that we have, I just make this a little bit bigger, is this is the cornea material, and what you'll see here is it's really just transparent with some shininess applied to it. The next material, these are what we call V-Ray materials. These are specifically materials that are used for the V-Ray renderer, and they're optimized for V-Ray as well. So the second material here is the V-Ray Eyes material. It's a simplified version of what we're using for the face, and it's just got a gray map to it. And you might wonder, why am I just working in gray? And really what I'm doing here, before we get started, before we really try to do any kind of subsurface scattering or anything more advanced than that, is to just simply bring in the displacement maps and normal maps and apply them to a very basic kind of shader to make sure that they work, to make sure that you're getting the results that you expect, that it matches up with what you did in ZBrush. And once you know that for sure, then you can start working on creating the more intricate shaders. So for the eyes, I keep it really simple. You can just use this material. It's just basically a basic gray with a it's really quite almost I think the same, just default settings really. The face, however, is different, and this one's worth pointing out. I've changed around things like the glossiness factors and the index of refractions, and we are going to plug into the face our textures. So what I want you to do here is that for each one of these different, when you bring in your model, you'll need to go and probably go into your outliner and find the various pieces. So like the corneas, you select both of those, and then you could right click on the cornea material here and choose Assign Material to Selection. Then you could go and find the eyeball eyeball geometry, and then right click and choose Assign Material to Selection on the VR eyes. And then of course you could select the face and assign the VR face, and there'll just be a really quick setup that way. Now we'll be back into the Hypershade momentarily, but let's just quickly go in and pop back to our render cam, and I am going to go into the V-Ray IPR. And I'll just let that calculate there. So now if you don't have a really great graphics card, then you don't need to necessarily use the V-Ray IPR. You could go through and just start using the settings that I have set up here in the normal render settings. So in the render view, you could just go in and create various little renders, but do it at a low resolution first. So I don't know what this is at the moment, but you could do it not at 1600 necessarily. You could do like either 400 by 400 or 800 by 800 width render. And okay, so pop down out of that. Now that we have all those materials applied, actually I verified that I do have all those materials applied because I did bring in a new model. So just dump VR face on there. There we go, cool. Now VR face is different from what the default material was that was applied to it to begin with. I don't have to change the other ones for like the eyes because I didn't bring in new eyes or anything like that, so those ones stay the same. All right, so what we want to do here in our Hypershade is to graph out our face material. And in order to do that, what we're going to do is select the face material here. And I'm going to click on this button right here, which is Graph Input and Output Connections. And what that does is down here in my work area, it shows me everything that plugs into this, which currently there's nothing on this side, and everything that plugs out of it, which is this shading group, which is what SG stands for. All right, so this node here tells me all of the information about my material. And the shading group over here is where I can plug in things like the displacement material. All right, you don't need to make any changes to this, but we do need to plug in our displacement map. So in order to plug in the displacement map, I'm going to come over here to the shading group, click on that, and under here is the option for displacement material. Now this is an external file, so I'm going to click on the little checkerboard and let this think. There we go. And I'm going to choose from the create render node options a file node. And this way I can link to my computer the files that I've rendered out. Now just to be clear about that, I'm going to show you what those are. I have here in this folder the displacement, normal, and cavity maps that I exported out. And if I go into displacement, for instance, you'll see that I have the U0V0 tile and the U1V0 tile. Same thing in the normal maps, and same thing here in the cavity maps. Now, and so I can really quickly sort of show that to you in the cavity maps. That's the U0V0 tile, and that's the U1V0 tile. Right, and these would all match that same kind of layout. Now, in order to create the proper displacement that we're going to work from, I could use just strictly the files that I rendered out, but there is a way to optimize V-Ray rather, using one of its internal little programs. And what that does is it takes the files that you've written, the texture files that you've written, especially things like an EXR file, and it optimizes it so that at render time it actually saves some speed, which is great, especially if you're rendering a large sequence. In order to do that, what we need to do is to go to our program files. So what I'm going to do is navigate to my program files real quick, and let's just see, go to C drive, program files, and we're going to come down to this chaos group, actually, that does V-Ray, and this is for Maya 2017, in my case, whatever version you're using. Now, this is going to be in the bin folder, and we're looking for this little application here, image to tile EXR. So if I double click on this, this creates what's called a tiled texture. I don't really understand all the ins and outs of it, but what I do know is if you use this on an EXR image, it will help to render the image faster in V-Ray, and that's pretty much all you really need to know. So this is a 32-bit image. So I'm going to change that to 32-bit pixel type. I can leave the compression as is. I can leave pretty much everything else as is. I can change color mode to grayscale because it is a grayscale displacement map. And it's not going to be a single file. I have 2 files in there, so I'm going to change this to multiple files. So it's going to ask me for my input directory. If I just go back to that real quick here, I'm going to copy that directory there. All right, paste that there. And output directory, now if I just navigate to that same place, I'm going to create a new folder in that folder, and we're just going to call this tiled. Or I'll just keep it lowercase like I did. Tiled. Right? And I'll just say select folder. So now I have that tiled folder in there, and this is saying that's where it's going to write that out to, and this is where it's going to get it from. Once I do that, I click convert now, it's going to go through and it's going to find these 2 files here, and then it's going to convert them into tiled versions. The tiled versions are, as far as I'm concerned, when I look at them, are going to look exactly the same. However, their file sizes are a little bit different. Usually, funny enough, the file sizes of the tiled images are actually bigger than the tiled sizes of the sizes of the original images, yet they still render faster. So this is just giving me a little bit of a indication of how long things are taking. It doesn't take very long on my computer. And here, just in a couple seconds, we should be done. I'll just pause for now. Okay, there we go. Now, if I just look at this, I have these 2 images here. The original one was 158, 151. They are now 208 and 198. So they're significantly larger, but they will render faster, and they're the ones I'm going to bring in. So it's not necessary that you do this, and you only need to do it for the displacement ones because it's only the displacement that is in EXR format. But if you do it, it will save you time in the long run. So I'm just going to pop back into the Hypershade now. And what we had done when we clicked on creating our displacement material here, that popped in a file node, and that now has the displacement shader itself set here and file 1. Now file 1 is where we are going to plug in that image. So I'm going to go here and click on my folder to bring in the image, and I'm going to navigate to that directory, which I saved out the directory there so I can just copy paste. And I'm just going to click on the very first one. In fact, actually I don't want that one, I want tiled, but it's going to now take it a moment here to think. Okay, just double click on tiled. I actually want this one here. Now, unfortunately, the naming here is not going to help me out. I want the naming to match how they were originally named, which was just with the U0 and V0 extensions at the end. So I'm just going to quickly click cancel there, and I'm going to pop on over into this folder. It's important that the U0, V0 extensions are at the end, but I will keep the word tiled in there. So let's just step back. Underscore tiled underscore U0 V0. There we go. It's open in Maya. Shouldn't be. Pretty sure that I closed out of it, but it doesn't seem to remember that it closed out of it. All right. Let's just see if it'll let me do that now. Okay, so Maya is giving me a little bit of a fussiness here. I'm just going to pause the video. In fact, this is probably a good place to just quickly stop. So between now and the next video, I'm just going to close out of Maya, rename these, and I'll start Maya back up, and we'll just continue on from where we left off. See you in the next video.